starting crazy wars. And I would agree. I mean, I'm not saying that if you're patriarchy you'll never be destroyed. I'm saying really that you just have a higher probability of solving problems and avoiding them if you're if you're a patriarchy, because um, if you're a matriarchy, people will just not use facts and logic if if it if it doesn't pay them to, particularly if they're
What do you
punished.
mean by matriarchy? Maybe that would help because when I think of matriarchy, most matriarchies are tend to be um, prehistoric, or they're generally found in tribal settings, clan groups uh, that are pre-civilizational in the Western sense of the term. So you'll find they were common in North America with Native Americans.
Hmm.
They've been around for thousands and thousands of years uh, in the Amazon or in Africa, but they aren't they so uh, they don't generally, when we talk about matriarchy properly speaking, where there is a wise woman or wise women um, kind of organizing and running the clan, um, tribe, village, whatever, is that these are usually small groups and they aren't, they don't, that's what I think of when you talk about matriarchy. Uh, what do you
Yes,
mean when you say matriarchy?
I would say there are societies that take marriage less seriously than patriarchy, because without most people being married parents, um, you're not a patriarchy. You would be a matriarchy. That's the objective criteria that I would use to distinguish the two. So if more people, if most parents are married parents and you're a patriarchy, and if it's the other way around, you're a matriarchy.
What's an example of a matriarchy right now?
The West, really, because I have come across statistics that say, well, in the UK and Canada anyway, that there are more unmarried or never married parents than there are married parents.
Mm.
And this comes with social problems, juvenile delinquency, underachievement, and usually only children brought up in fatherless homes, subsequently suffering, yes, underachievement, juvenile delinquency, and perhaps mental health issues.
Well, the original, okay, say patriarchy, if you really, I mean, at its root in Western civilization was a very absolutist. The man was a kind of absolutist monarch of his home, in say Rome or Greece, and the women and children under anyone under his care, women, children, or slaves, were pretty much, they lived or died based on his whim. I mean, he could have sex with any lesser at any time he wanted. He could dispose of them. He could sell his children into slavery. He could um, prostitute his daughters. He could his sons. He could murder them. He could, until they they lived completely at his discretion, lived or died. Over
Yes.
time, that changed. That changed even within the Roman Empire. See,
I was going to mention the Roman Empire.
it evolved over time, and in fact, and Christianity, in fact, played a role in changing the relationship that lessers had with their graders. So the only way to humiliate, I mean, in fact, the most humiliating thing for a Roman man was to play the role of the lesser to 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 a lesser person. In other words, say in sex, um, they didn't have a problem with homosexual intercourse. What was looked frowned upon was for a dominant male to play the submissive role, what they perceived to be the submissive role. That could be scandalous. And for example, Hadrian had a controversial relationship with a lover, and it was pretty scandalous. Um, so, but over time, now I mean the sex thing that didn't change so much, but they did rights became ultimately, citizenship was expanded. They never developed the same kind of universal rights between men and women that we would develop many, many centuries later. But it was, um, so what were you going to say about the Roman Empire? See, to me, it's that patriarchy started out with extreme power. At what I would argue is that I don't know if it's we're giving way into a matriarchy from patriarchy, except that we are just patriarchy has just over the centuries um, been diluted of power over time and has itself evolved to the point where we're just organizing our society in a different way. I wouldn't call it either matriarchy or patriarchy, but that way is I think you can have maybe there's a third category out there. Whatever we could call it is a more democratic way of organizing ourselves instead of thinking of it in terms of levels of absolute power based on sex.
Um, well, monogamy is a kind of democracy of sex because it says that however attractive you are, you you're only entitled to one spouse and therefore one sex partner that you're supposed to stick by. But obviously, if you're very wealthy, attractive, charming, etc., you'll have a greater choice of marriage partners. But you're still only allowed one spouse that you're supposed to stick to. And that was better than, say, the emperor having a harem, because every time he died, all his sons would have to kill each other in order to inherit the throne, and that would be very disturbing and disruptive to civil order.
Right. Well, we've even moved on in terms of power. We had moved on. Now it seems like we're revisiting the situation. The subject again is as defining legitimate power versus illegitimate power. Illegitimate power is taken by force. Legitimate power is derived from the consent of the governed. And um, so you just so the idea of, I mean, say the president had 10 sons and the president of the United States had 10 sons, and those 10 sons, if they lived under the delusion that, well, the if they killed off their competitors, they saw each other as competitors for his power. And so they'll say one son managed to kill off the nine others. um, that would give him, under within American civilization, that would give him no more power, no more right to govern, having killed off his perceived competition. He'd have no more right to rule than than anyone else. I mean, it was his. If he had power, it would be illegitimate if it wasn't derived from the consent of the population or from the governed. So we just have a completely different way of managing the exchange of power and transition of power from one person to another, one
Yeah, but
president to
that,
another.
I, and that's because you're a republic, and the idea is that all men are created equal and they are all equally entitled to run for president if they satisfy the minimum conditions of running for president, being over 35, born in America, and others that I might not be aware of. But if you were a monarchy, then um, and if you were the emperor and you had all these, hundreds of sons, then I suppose they would have to kill each other to inherit, unless you appoint one of them. And I think that there's a
Well,
special term for
that's
it.
but even then, if you go back into the Bible, which is really curious, there is a scene in Samuel, First Samuel, where the people are clamoring for a king, and Samuel is resistant. And finally, he tells them what a king is going to do for you. He's going to take the best of everything. He's going to use your children and your the best. He's gonna take from you and soak you dry, and he's going to oppress you, and he's going to rule over you. But okay, you want a king. I'll find you a king. Basically, is the gist of the story. And he goes around and he botches the first attempt. He finds Saul, and when he sees that Saul has botched it, then he goes around and finds David, and then he anoints David. But my point is that even within the Bible, and David is a major character. He's probably the most written about character in the Old Testament. Um, and David's kingdom is the kingdom everybody looks to. Jews look back to it and saying that's what the Messiah is going to restore, is more or less David's kingdom. Um, Christians admire him as a man after God's own heart, and so on and so forth. But even his kingdom was actually the result of, I think, what the writers are doing there with that story, or the editors, is they're communicating that David, there would be no king without the consent of the people. That, in a sense, even in the early Iron Age, late Bronze Age, I guess it'd be early Iron Age, he's he is they had a legitimacy problem. And in fact, this is a big problem for the David Saul narrative, is David's been anointed to be the replacement king for Saul, but he can't just take it by violence. He can't kill Saul, even when he has the opportunity to kill Saul and murder him or assassinate him. He doesn't take it. Um, it's There is a tension even within a culture that has a long history of monarchy, like the Jews had in the Old Testament. They it originates it only originates as a demand from the people that they have a king so that they can compete with their peers, their internationally. So even I don't think monarchy solves the problem of legitimacy.
I'm certainly not a monarchist, but because um, the whole point of Christianity, as I see it, is to defend the divine right of kings. And that was exactly what the founding fathers were rejecting when they founded their republic. Hence, what they said about men being created equal with certain unalienable rights, amongst them life, meaning that no monarch is going to sign your death warrant and have you executed without even so much as a trial,
Mm-hmm.
which monarchs have been known to do. And you would have liberty, but obviously within the law, and obviously what is within the law is a matter of great dispute unless you go by God's laws, and then you find well, you should be able to get a whole list of them from whichever book you choose to use.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So
so what? But where do you? Okay, so again, I just to me it seems like what difference does it make to address the issues of the day with in terms of what are you trying to say about monarch with about matriarchy and patriarchy? Let's put it that way.
oh, oh
What
right.
problem are you addressing when you're talking about that?
Well, as I see it, patriarchy is eugenic because it because it forces anyone who wants to have sex and children to jointly apply for a marriage license with their intended. It's an extra hoop for you
Mm-hmm.
to jump through in order to get the right to have sex and children. And that is what the marriage license is for, which in America, you still call it the marriage license. In the UK, it's called, this a marriage certificate, and people don't really quite get the idea, or the meaning has been lost. And so in many ways the words used to describe certain things are all important. And I know once upon a time, even Christians thought that fornication was a mortal sin. So if you die and didn't properly repent of your mortal sin, you're heading for hell. And then suddenly they forgot all about that. But monogamy obviously helped the European um, organize himself and his society better than, say, the Native Americans and all the other cultures that they colonized. Because I think monogamy produces the most stable society of all. In that you don't have confused children, thinking that he's one of the many um, offspring of his father, and he's got many half siblings, and they don't necessarily get on with him, and their mothers don't necessarily like him or his mother. It's probably quite a lot of emotional adjustment and emotional insecurity, I imagine. And then
Do you
yeah.
no? I just do. So there are a lot of there are Muslim countries, particularly Arab. I don't know about the current state of Iran, but I know that um, my family did business with Iranians who were I guess expats, um, who and they it was a plural marriage situation.
Hmm.
I know lots of there are. I don't know how common it is beyond that Middle East region, but I mean, Persia is still, I mean, Iran is kind of east of the Middle East, but um, there's a, because it's not monogamy. They aren't monogamous. What do you maybe define what you mean by monogamy? Because I mean, cause I don't think of one man with three wives as a monogamous as being a monogamist, or do
Oh
you?
no, that would be polygamy, but the Quran actually says monogamy is the ideal, but tolerates polygamy polygamy up to a maximum of four wives, because it says have more than one only if you can afford them and you can be fair to them.
Mhm.
And it basically says, and you probably won't be able to be fair to them, and you probably will be, you know, biting off more than you can chew. But I suppose in certain circumstances it would be sensible, but it wouldn't be because the men are having fun, because really the
Okay, so
cost
we're
of
working in the same terminology here. I just wonder if you had a different definition for monogamy than I had. So, okay, so polygamy is tolerated within Islam but isn't encouraged.
yes.
Okay. Um, So then the question is can you enforce monogamy? Um, I think in the United States we've come to the conclusion um, that it's impossible to um, force certain forms of morality, even if they are, say, economically or socially beneficial in some logical, rational sense.
Well,
Uh,
you had the
People want,
Mormon extermination order, didn't you? And it was basically the monogamous men of America saying we can't let them, but the Mormons do their polygamy thing because if we do, we'll just take over.
was that the actual rationale? I don't, I thought,
I know it's not officially stated,
yeah,
but I.
I don't remember ever seeing anything like that. I know that there were, most of the 19th century experiments with polygamy or plural sex or strange forms of family organization that were various experiments in the 19th century. Most of them were brought to an end because um, powerful men um, within these communities ultimately crossed the line with somebody's daughter that got them into trouble.
Hmm.
So it's they could live in they usually found places in isolation, geographically isolated, and then ultimately um, civilization caught up with them, and the isolation, when as soon as they couldn't maintain the isolation any longer because the railroads developed and commerce and populations increased and so on, um, the mainstream civilization rubbed up against these groups, whether it was Oneida, whether it was the Mormons, um, or other experiments. Most of these experiments failed. Um, but with regard to alternatives to monogamy, um, they they were treated pretty roughly ultimately by the government, by the and with the approval of the American people. Sometimes
They were
brought
run across the entire continent from the eastern seaboard until they got to Utah,
Utah.
didn't they? And
Yeah,
yeah,
and then
I think they were
for them to
basically told
become a
to give it
state, they
up.
wanted. I'm just sorry. They just to become a state, they had to reject um, polygamy.
Mm,
That was the condition. One of the
hmm.
conditions for them becoming a state. And that's I don't know. I don't know the whole story in granular detail, but I think that's
Hmm.
the gist of it. It was a condition for them
Yes.
entering the union as a state. And
Have you seen American Primeval, Mark?
no, I haven't seen that one. I don't think. What's it about?
Oh, it's basically about the Mountain Meadows
Oh, yes, I
massacre.
have. It's a drama, huh?
Uh huh.
It's yes, it's about the wars, the Mormon wars. Yes, yes, yes. Now I
Yeah.
remember. Yeah, it's pretty rough, pretty violent.
Oh.
Yeah. I think I don't know how accurate, historically accurate it is, but it was an interesting watch. It took me a minute to remember. Yes, that was
Hmm.
not a bad movie or
Yeah.
show.
Yeah.
Was it a series or a movie? I can't remember.
Yes, it was a series.
Okay.
But very. It seemed very realistic and gritty to me, and yes, and
Yes.
well, it showed how mean Mormons were to each other because one of them was a Mormon and they were actually hunting him down to kill him to stop him being telling the authorities of their plan. I forgot what it was now. Mm. But
I just the problem we have is that I don't well we can't restore you can't. I mean, it's like I think trying to make America patriarchal again is like trying to revivify a corpse. It'll just end up like a kind of Frankenstein's monster.
Why do you think that? You could give people plenty of notice, Mark, and say, well, this isn't working, and you all hate immigration, don't you? And the reason for immigration is because there's a labor shortage, because you're not producing enough babies and bringing them up properly, and no one wants to hire them. And, and it's like, well, if you want to well, I think the case could be put, and nobody's going to say no, no, no. There's no labour shortage at all. It's all a terrible conspiracy by this group or that group. I mean, I don't think anybody can deny that the pull of mass immigration is a labour shortage. And obviously, labor relations is a very difficult thing to get right. And it took the Romans quite a while to get their labor relations right when they finally decided to give the plebs some rights and, appoint tribunes and people to look after the plebeians who were actually literate and, I guess, well, very good for the Roman army. But then after Rome became an empire, the labour market was flooded with slaves, and therefore the rich people preferred to deal with slaves rather than free, Roman labour, and in the end they had their welfare state in Rome, and that was why they had the bread dole and the and the, and being entertained by bread and circuses, and they declined and degenerated, and then refused to join the army, and Rome was forced to hire mercenaries. And that, according to Machiavelli, was the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, because once you hire mercenaries, it means you're not up to doing your own fighting, and 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 people, well, acted accordingly, I guess.
Well,
And
I think you have to. There's a lot of missing detail. I mean, the period between, say, the you had an evolution of of status um, between the plebs and the plebeians and the what was the upper class
patricians,
patricians. Thank you. Um, they they evolved over time as well. As I recall, I believe Julius Caesar's family was not patrician, even though it was an old family and well established. It wasn't a true patrician family, um, and yet it gained status within the Roman Republic by the time he's out and about. But he's not. He was kind of a young man on the make, right? He becomes enormously rich only out of necessity, and he goes off and kills and murders a bunch of Gauls, and he basically becomes rich in so doing, right?
hmm
Enormously rich, as opposed to there were other. I think the famous Brutus, his family was properly patrician. Um, um, all of that gets. I mean, it that, but you can't compare, say, the Roman society of the late Republic or Rome of the early empire to, say, Rome of the third or fourth century. See, at some point,
no.
it's radically different. And
Mm.
ultimately, by the time that the West is when the Western Roman Empire collapses, it has already become a feudal society. People are attaching to specific plots of land and to having relationships with the land and the owner or patriarch of the land in unique and new ways, right? And in the East, they remain pretty strong and vibrant. The problem is in the East, they face other problems. they're in a state of perpetual war with the Persians or whoever they were called at the time. I can't remember. And then they had plague, the Justinian plague, which was devastating. Um, and then not long after, so comes Islam, and the some things I've read about it is that it, Islam kind of stumbles across a situation that is um, they're kind of able to kind of skatewalk into a a pretty beleaguered society that's been torn apart by war. They've got internal strife between orthodox and heterodox groups, and then of course disease, and so it's their territories are conquerable as a result. They still managed to survive though until ultimately into the 15th century. Well, they and calling themselves Roman the whole time.
Yes, and the Roman Catholic Church and all that, but I think we should remember that Rome had a very long history and didn't have the same kind of government in its long history, because it started, the city state of Rome started as a people who hated kings, because they had this, what, Tarquin Superbus, the Tarquin the proud, and he was a terrible king, and they got rid of him, and they established their republic, and
Well, for
it
some
probably.
reason, nobody thought. I mean, it was everyone seemed to think that uh, societies need to be ruled by one man. From Augustus on. I mean, in the West, it's like the human imagination closed entirely on, and there was republics were just viewed as unstable by just intrinsically unstable and kind of defenseless, unable to organize their own defense, and they would be somehow people always just went to the assumption that a strong man of some kind, emperor, king, or chieftain, or whatever, warlord, was necessary to govern a society. Um, it wasn't. I know that there were experiments with republicanism in the lead up to the United States forming its constitution, but no one thought it could last, and that's
Yes, that.
the
Mm.
big debate. That's Ben Franklin's famous quote. What kind of government have you given us? And it's a republic if you can keep it, right?
Yes, so in Europe, called Christendom, which is a portmanteau word for a continent of Christian monarchs, Christian kingdoms. Um, well, that was the age of monarchy, which um, was which was ended by the founding of the American Republic, because the French Revolution quickly followed the American Revolution. You have the same statues of liberty in France and New York. So,
Well, it doesn't really end. The old order doesn't really end until World War One. I mean, it takes time. There's 100 years
mm,
between
mm,
the end of the Napoleonic era and the beginning of World War One, and the it's like some of the Napoleonic reforms were kind of brought in and integrated into the old order, but it was the old order still overcame the Republican order that the French tried to force on Europe. And even they, though, discarded their most of the many of the Republican values because they defaulted to an emperor, and
oh,
that emperor and it was going to be there was a lot of family. I mean, involved there
Yes, so
too. So
yes, they were all related to each other, the European royal families. But yes, you're right that for that there was 10 years of the English Republic, and then the monarchy was restored, and the monarchy was also briefly restored after the French Revolution. And I suppose the Russian revolutionaries thought, well, we don't want a restoration, so we better kill the whole lot of them. And that was what they did in 1918. They exterminated the entire
mhm,
Romanov family.
mhm,
And and what was very interesting about it was that Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, knew the game was up, and he actually applied. He sought asylum in Britain from um,
mhm,
George
right.
George V, his first cousin, who said, "No, you can't come, you can't come," and so well, that was a terrible thing. I mean, blood is not thicker than water, even amongst the blue-blooded European royals. But that was because I, George was told that things are a bit wobbly after the war. If you allow cousin Nicholas to come over, you know who knows what the British people might do after such a terrible war, which they will blame on the monarch. So I don't think um, these events were properly studied. And I think that the British government has an interest in ignoring all these events because it wants to keep the British monarchy going. And it's also very useful to America, the British monarchy, in that, you
Well,
know,
yeah, that was that was something that was pretty intentional by the um, particularly Washington set up. There was the first presidents of the United States did not want to get involved. Well, for a long time, Americans didn't want to get involved with European or any international um, squabble, and there was I mean, we alliances, entangling alliances, right? That's a phrase that reflects a major concern of the American founders and of Americans in general. They just for a very long time, of course, that gave way to something very different. Because
yes,
it turned out the world is smaller than we thought, and we had to adapt. So now
yes, I
we
forget
have
which,
many.
yes, I forget which war it was that I think it was 1814 or 1815, and that was when Americans could decide whether to support the British or the French. I think it was a 7 years war.
Well,
And
the War of 1812.
yes, that's the one.
The War of 1812 it was up for debate who America was going to go to war with at the time, and but the British, what they were doing, because they needed sailors, they were they they would just you know come along, take control of any American merchantman ship. That's all we had. They didn't have proper navy really, and they would seize the ship, and anyone, even if if say the sailor was born in the UK but had American citizenship, they wasn't called the UK back then. It was born in England or something, and they was what happened were those men were seized and conscripted into the Royal Navy, and this became a huge offense, you know, for the Americans. Um, they were disrupting our commerce. They were basically kidnapping American citizens and forcing them into service, into military service. And this was one of the reasons why we ended up at war with Britain during the War of 1812. Um, I'm not sure what that has to do with anything other, well, what we're talking about, but it was what. You mentioned the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War precedes the American Revolution. That was a kind.
Um,
That was the war that gave that more or less shoved France out of North America once and for all. Gave Britain control of Canada and much of, uh, say, the eastern half of the what would become the United States, and all the way kind of. It's an interesting map to look at,
mhm.
um, but then the revolution would be fought, and um, America would get territory east of the Appalachian Mountains and so on and so forth. But go ahead.
Yes, I think the general advice um, in Washington's farewell speech was not to get involved in any of the wars. The Europeans were always fighting with each other, and they would fight each other at the drop of a hat. And I suppose the idea is that yes, once you start supporting one side, you just won't be able to get out of it. And uh, maybe that situation is repeated in the war in Ukraine, because there will be other Europeans who will want the war to continue for their own geopolitical or reasons, and um and I suppose it can be expensive and possibly ruinous, because I think Spain destroyed itself by sponsoring all these wars, these imperial wars, and getting um yes, I think they did. I'm afraid I'm a bit vague about the detail, but but I suppose that's the nature of empire. You acquire it by war, and of course you will lose it by war, and that's why um, well, you have to be so careful about which wars you choose to fight, and every war is a gamble, and um, I think possibly the reason why America is now more at war than usual is because it's falling into its Thucydides trap, which is, I guess, a very old idea.
Well,
Um,
but the World War II resulted in a huge vacuum of power that either the United States or the Soviet Union was going to fill. And since the United States was best positioned to take over the responsibilities of the British Empire and also kind of form its own. Peter Zion has talked about this quite a bit. Um, create its own network of commercial alliances, um, that to participate, that would result in military alliances, but to participate in the kind of the American order after World War II. There were a certain set of conditions, and it took the shape that it took. Right? I mean, it was no coincidence that the NATO countries are all democratic in nature, more or less. Um, until very recently, it was um, they held many values in common, and it was easy for them to work together, and it was to everyone's benefit.
well, I think there may be a few stories to disrupt this narrative, in that the Iron Curtain need not have fallen over Europe, but it was in the interest of the military-industrial complex to create this enmity against Russia, to sell lots of arms to the Europeans who joined NATO and who are now um, things of the past. And um, and one of the things that Washington said in his speech was that an overgrown military establishment is inauspicious to Republican liberty. And I suppose, they would have interest in, well, we're going to make money every time we drop a bomb somewhere. And because then we have to make some more, and they'll keep paying us. And it's a good way of, making money. And when there's actually no more domestic industries that make things, because most of the things that make things, most of the factories that make things that people want, are in China anyway, and left with nothing else but weapons. There's this idea that every problem is a nail when you have a hammer.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe people don't consciously fall into these modes of thinking, but it's easy to see how people might start thinking like that, just because um, well, part of the Thucydides trap is that if you if you think a rival empire is catching up with you, but the plan is to destroy them because before they get stronger, and this, I think, was what Britain did to Germany, because of course that the more Germans than there are, English people. Germany's a bigger country, and they used to be Catholic, and the Germans all over Europe, and I believe most Europeans of uh, uh, white Americans, heritage Americans, come from German stock, because, well, there were just so many more Germans than there were, you know, English people. And
Well, the British, what I believe the British, their goal was always to kind of keep a balance of power within Europe. And so this is why you always see them shifting who they support in any given conflict throughout the 19th century. It seemed like they were not
hmm
keen to let any one side dominate,
hmm
and then is it Bismarck who comes along and wants to uh, it's you have the Prussian Franco-Prussian War that ultimately results in the formation of Germany as a
yes, yes, that
unified
that
state.
unified Germany, but the English would be nervous of, you know the
The unified,
enlargement and the
yeah.
reunion of Germany. And well, even though they were, both Protestants and, once the same tribe, because they were, well, they're Teutonic, aren't they? The Anglo-Saxons and the Saxons. I suppose that there will always be these problems. And talking about history, the history that I learned was that, yes, there was this alliance system, and it became inevitable, just because the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914, and it was just years later, after I finished, my um, studies of history as a schoolgirl, that you heard, well, it wasn't anything to do with the alliance system and the people being dragged into, all these um, groups competing against each other. It was the building of the Berlin to Baghdad railway that annoyed the British so much that they felt that they had to destroy Germany. And the evidence is that um, in both World War One and World War Two, Britain declared war on Germany. And the Germans were saying, we don't even want to fight you. Why are you doing this?
Well, that's I would say though that the Germans, well, they did it because the Germans they they were allowed to nibble away at and just outright invade their neighbors and disrupt the balance of power and violate the. I think you could say that Britain and France were trying to support a new and fragile world order where nations no longer establish boundaries through conflict, but or through war making, but through negotiation. And the Germans certainly didn't negotiate their takeover of Czechoslovakia or their attack on Poland. That was just blatant,
But I think
unrestrained
Poland was
violence.
always Germany's backyard, and Britain didn't
But
really
German,
have any
but Poles had
interest.
an identity that preceded the nation of Germany. In fact, the Poles had an empire long before.
Mm.
Um, it wasn't it the Polish Lithuanian.
Yes, and it
Um,
extended as far as Italy and Brindisi. Um, but I think the Germans. What, I've forgotten what I was going to say. I'm sorry.
that's all right. No, no. Just the Germans didn't have. I mean, this is the problem with history. Um, there's always it's very much you can almost any narrative can be told depending on where you place your emphasis, your focus of attention. So it's um, I think you know what we want is a serviceable narrative that conveys um, a reasonable statement of the facts that we can most of us can agree upon
Hmm.
and find useful, right? I mean, it's I don't think and it's very World War I is one of those subjects right now. Is it seems like you lots of people like to debate who's really at fault in what started, what got World War I going and kept it going. World War II now it used to be not be up for debate. It wasn't something that was really discussed, at least not here in the West. Um, in the United States, it was not very controversial about who started that war and why it was fought. Now it seems like people don't want to buy into the old narrative. They want to play with
Mm.
new ones, and that's their privilege. But I think it's still pretty hard to prove that Germany didn't have Germany could have been just fine. Um, uh, in fact, Germany ultimately West Germany would thrive as a kind of rump state of its former self. It lost probably its eastern third of the country, plus everything that it had lost in World War I, and in the post-World War order, World War II order, West Germany thrived to become the kind of industrial heart of the NATO alliance and the European Union.
Hmm.
It was, in fact, was so wealthy and so powerful, it was able to absorb its eastern, reabsorb the East Germany into its political and
Yeah.
social economy
Yes,
effectively.
the reunification.
That was a remarkable achievement.
Mm. Well, I guess when there's a will, there's a way. But I think,
All I'm saying is that they didn't, even though they suffered greatly under the war, both wars, they didn't, they lost two world wars in a row. They ended up with they ended up with controlling much less land than they had ever aspired to, and what in fact they did have, right? They lost huge pieces of real estate in the loss of those two world wars when they gave up making war as a way of expanding their influence and power in the world, but turned to cooperation and economic development, they thrived.
yes, but they're not doing so well now. Um, but going back to what you were saying about historical narratives, there is this idea that Um, I don't know if you've heard of a historian called A.J.P. Taylor who said that World War II was a continuation of World War One, and he's now been called a revisionist historian, which is kind of shocking, considering I learned, I had to read his books. So suddenly he's no longer fashionable because he made the point that World War II was a continuation of World War One, and
I don't think he's alone in that. That's becoming a pretty mainstream idea. What is the name of the guy who wrote um oh, he's married to, what is his name? He's a British, he's
Neil
a
Ferguson,
Neil Ferguson, thank you. He's an American. He's a Brit, but
a
he's also an
Scotsman.
American now.
Hmm.
And he argues for basically the same idea, that they really it was just
He's a
another 30 years
neocon.
war, another 30 years war, basically, that the from
Yes, the second 30 Years' War
mhm.
is the periodization of World War One and World War Two,
Yeah.
as in a very ruinous
And what I would
war.
say is that period is it's a war over how the Western world is to govern itself. Um, whether it was to, because the options were communism, Bolshevism, um, decrepit monarchism, or American democracy, American style or republicanism, democracy of some sort. And I think in that case, for a complicated set of reasons, it was the American democracy that won out, at least in the short term. Now, we're now in a period where it's in question whether that result can survive
Hmm.
the 21st century, but the result was pretty definitively American democracy, even even with all of America's hypocrisies and the you know the
Hmm.
all the
Well,
complications with. Go ahead.
yes, I was thinking of liberalism being imposed on Weimar Germany, and well, that was what they had to do, become a republic after the Kaiser abdicated, and it didn't work for them, and then Hitler
Well, was it really
suspended constitution.
imposed? It just arose, and the Weimar is really weird too. It wasn't it was weak, but it wasn't as democratic in the American sense of the term. I mean, you wouldn't look at you know Germany was in a state in 19 at the end of 1918 and going into 1919. They were in a state of civil war
Hmm.
between gangs of Bolsheviks and gangs of proto-fascists,
Hmm.
militarists, um, shooting it out. And it's been a while since I've read that history, so I'm not real fluent in being able to convey the details. But you know, Weimar was a kind of attempt to put together a German democracy with no to create institutions out of whole cloth in a country that really had no history of democracy. Wasn't there were that there is no German Republican past. They didn't even have the United States had the English tradition to look back upon, going all the way to the Magna Carta, right? Of limited power and a history of internal powers counterbalancing each other. That is both. It's not just an American invention, but it has its roots in England. Germany had none of that. A lot of
Yes,
their
I think the Kaiser was an absolute monarch, wasn't
That's
he?
right.
He
Right.
wasn't a
He wasn't maybe
constitutional
as
monarch.
absolutist as the Russian monarch, but he was absolute.
Mm, mm. And, and
And
and that was, yes, and that was a cause of, well, he had to take responsibility. I mean, that's the nature of being an absolute monarch. Um, because if you have absolute power, then it is assumed you took absolute responsibility, and when things go wrong, you would get it in the neck. Um, hmm.
but they
but
were
but but
it would, oh, oh, go ahead, go ahead and say what you.
well, I was just saying that I don't think English people understood how it was swinging, not so much between all these sort of secular political ideologies like Nazism and fascism, but really it was about being a republic, or being a monarchy, or keeping up an appearance of monarchy, because for India, it was important to kind of project power to its colonies by having a monarch. And I don't think that the British government saw that, some, here today, gone tomorrow prime minister was going to do it. It had to be, you know, um, a monarch, to impress the Orientals, I suppose.
Now, you see, the, the problem for British imperialism is it's not just you've got economic exploitation, you've got real racism, um, Eurocentrism, uh, corruption, all of it at play, and
Hmm.
of a population of a nation, one nation that's actually much smaller than the other, dominating the bigger nation, right? The smaller nation dominating the larger one, and they the way they chose to do it was kind of with a iron fist on the one hand, and then a diplomacy on the other. So it wasn't the Raj a hodgepodge of forces allied together to maintain British power in India. It wasn't. It wasn't. I guess you could say it was uniquely English in the sense that they had little princes that collaborated with them, and they
Hmm.
also played forces. This is the British have been good at this for long. They did this in Europe, playing forces against each other, playing Hindus up against Muslims, and so on and so forth.
Yes,
Um,
divide and rule.
and that's been kind of their model of had been their model of empire for a long time, or at least their method of kind of not being overwhelmed by forces greater than themselves was by keeping them, as you said, divided, and uh, um,
Mm.
they never quite ruled effectively, but they ruled somehow. Um, but it was
Yes,
a
and they
it's
had this
condemned.
mystique that, and people were prepared to believe in it until the Japanese occupation of Malaya.
Right. Well, yeah,
Because,
there was always them as then of course they had this weird, you're all subjects of our queen, like we are subjects of our queen or king, right? I mean,
hmm,
they
hmm.
had it's so they had this ethereal sort of vision of the monarch as the mother or father of the people, um, very benevolent, all care, kind of a godlike figure, all caring and blessing everybody. It's all hugs and kisses. And yet, on the other hand, it was very different though than say Belgian imperialism in the Congo, for example, which
Hmm.
was just raw, violent, um, a rape of people and land, right?
Hmm.
Or they're very different from the Russian approach to their own empire, or the see that in the Germans, the German style of governing others leaned more towards were more like the Belgians in Africa or the Russians in Asia. they weren't British. They're somewhere, e- even as the English were or the British were hypocritical about it, there was enough meat on the bones, enough reality to the myth that ultimately people like Gandhi could leverage that into an independence movement. Is there anything
Yes,
there?
and it's also to do with the culture, the BBC, movies, and and things people loved, and for many people in the British Commonwealth, they call, they remembered, when Elizabeth came to the throne, and then these things stick in people's minds, I suppose, when um, a king or queen is crowned.
Well, and that's, I
And
think, what I think the difference between like I say, I'm going to group the Belgians, the Germans, and the Russians as one model of imperial rule, right? That is the pre-republican Germans. And say, okay, let's call it Prussian. So we could say the Belgian, Prussian, and Russian style of government, of imperial government, versus the Anglo-American style. And the Americans very much took from the British, enhanced it. I mean, and we probably took it to its logical extreme in the formation of the United Nations. Um, so that the goal, the stated goal, was a kind of assembly of free nations sharing, governing with integrity and um, with under a set of shared values, and then cooperating for towards world peace. Right? Of course, it's never realized because we didn't we only got halfway. It was a half baked job, right? We didn't. It's unclear whether now the big concern is that America is turning more towards an Eastern style of government than a Western one. We're not. Are we? Is Donald Trump giving up the Anglo-American? Um, is Trumpism a representation of the end of the Anglo-American model that
yes, and
made
what
us
would
great?
have to happen to make historians take note of that particular event? Um, I, I don't know if you've heard of Alexander Dugin's book,
Mm,
The Fourth Political Theory,
yes.
and and it's basically saying that there's three that it seems Westerners keep rotating on, which is liberalism, nationalism, and socialism, and he's saying there ought to be a fourth one because we're tired of the first three because it is that they're not going anywhere. and
Hmm.
and I think what he's saying is that they are kind of secular religions after Europeans in effect rejected Christianity, and obviously Europeans have a quite different attitude towards Christianity than Americans, because I think Americans have a an attachment to it because I suppose they don't have memories of their ancestors being burnt at the stake, or forced to pay fines if they don't go to church, and that kind of oppression, which I suppose the Europeans are more likely to remember.
Well, I mean, this is something that I've kind of touched on in the past. Is American Christianity is unique in that it's entirely voluntary,
Mm,
and it has no specific. It really has no roots to the land, and it's any attempts to the native and forms of Christianity that are native to America are totally unique. They're completely unlike anything that came before it. So it's
like
even whether
Seventh Day
it's,
Adventism
yes,
and
let's add that as
Jehovah's
a
Witness.
Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses,
Hmm.
um, And I would frankly even throw in the Pentecostals as a unique form of American religion. I don't think it's American Christianity. I would say it's a Christianity, but it's a form of Christianity that's it's it none of these. There were various attempts to all of these, you know, there were Protestantism in Europe had little hiccups or little that would occasionally belch forth something that looked like one of these American Christianities, but they were always very short lived, and they were quickly either isolated or completely snuffed out. Right? I mean, but they came. Sometimes they immigrated to the United States, and here is where they kind of survived and thrived. Um, but American Christianity is just completely unique, and so and it is voluntary. And the reason why it has done Christianity has done so well in America is that it it is voluntary. You didn't have you nothing imposing upon you from the state or the mainstream society, so that when you overthrew the powers that be in your society, you weren't also overthrowing your religion. In fact, in the United States, you could vote out your party and still keep going to the same church you went to, or start a new church or something.
Yes, so American varieties of Christianity would be the Amish and the Mennonites, and they use Christianity as a way of being pacifist, and that's why I suppose
Well, those are actually, ironically, the most European of they have European roots, but again, they came from Europe, and it's here where they really were able to establish themselves and thrive. Uh,
yes, so they were tired of being conscripted into fighting and dying for their king's imperial wars, and I guess that's why they came to America, and they just wanted to be farmers, peacefully farming, and not fighting for any imperial war, I suppose.
right, something like that. It it
Yeah.
it, it the it, so yeah, I just whatever's going to happen. I don't know. I don't. I guess I've lost the thread, but it's in the United States. I guess the debate in my mind is: are we going to? To me, it seems like we have good reason to maintain the order um, that arose out of World War II, the Anglo-American order, if you want to call it that, or just the American.
Yes,
The,
it seems that the narrative is being questioned and maybe undermined because of Zionism, I suppose. I mean, people are saying, "Oh, what was this Judeo-Christian thing? You know, it just used to be called Christianity, and then it be called then Christianity being called started being called Judeo-Christian, and there's something odd about this, and that kind of thing." And I remember first hearing about this expression from my history teacher talking about the Judeo-Christian heritage of the West, and making it sound like some kind of antique, which I suppose it was, because my history teacher, Mr. Beeching, was saying, uh, I think he was using that term in the sense of, well, you have no biblical knowledge, you don't seem to know your Bible at all, because nobody goes to Sunday school anymore, or something of that
Mhm.
nature, and and um, and obviously it's part of Western identity to know Bible stories.
Well, I just don't see. I mean, it. I mean, I think what Dugan represents when he's talking about a fourth order. Was it? What's the exact phrasing? I can't remember. It's
Well,
there have been
the
three,
fourth
and there needs to be a fourth one. What's
the
the?
fourth political theory.
Okay,
Yeah.
not liberal. not monarch. What are the three?
Not
Monarchy.
nationalism and not communism.
Okay, nationalism, communism, or liberalism. There needs to be a fourth.
Yes, and he couldn't quite define it, and to the extent that he defined it, it's like, well, it's supposed to be for the people, it's for the people, and and that made me think of, oh, you mean a people's democratic dictatorship, which is, Marxist Leninism, which is basically saying, well, instead of just the rich people and the king taking all the goodies, give some to the people and take their interests to heart and let their interests dominate the objectives of your government. Um, so it's that kind of idea, really.
Yeah.
A more equal distribution of resources, and maybe this thing called, the spiritual pie, going back to the idea of woo again, because if woo means anything nice, it means spirituality. It's this nice feeling you get when you think you're following the rules correctly. And I
Mm.
suppose I'm saying you won't know if you're following the rules correctly if you don't know what the rules are. So you're
Mm.
only guessing, and it might give you peace, to sort of think, well, I'm well within the rules what I'm doing, you know so I don't need to worry about, possibly breaking them. It's kind of, as clear as a speed limit. So if you know you're driving within the speed limit, you need not fear getting a speeding ticket, or something like that in the post. But because the rules keep changing, nobody really knows, whether they're on the right side or the wrong side of the road.
What rules are you thinking of that keep changing? What's changed so fast that you can't keep track of which side of the
Well,
road you're on?
well, the culture war that's been raging, um, across the West. I mean, you could say it began with the Kulturkampf when Bismarck took over, and obviously the Prussian state rubbed up against the Catholic Church, and that was why they had the, Vatican I, as they call it, right? Um, when the Pope promulgated the edict of papal infallibility, which suggested there was a problem to even have to issue to pass an edict saying that the Pope's word on this matter is final. Um, so I would say that Christianity, what was beginning to wobble, many centuries ago, um, because I mean, the only thing that kept it going was really executing heretics, and then they stopped doing that. They stopped doing that in Britain in 1697, and before 80 years was up, the American Revolution broke out. So we could say that there's something um, inherently unstable about Christianity because it had to be enforced so oppressively.
Oh, well, I think you could say the same thing about Islam. I mean, it's enforces it works to it. I think anything that has to use resort to violence to enforce any spiritual system that has to resort to coercion, um, which is the strength of American Christianity, because it doesn't have to do that. It's Christianity is still fairly vibrant in the United States compared to the rest of the world, and it it is that way. It's vibrant because it is free and it is voluntary.
Mm,
Nobody's forcing you to be anything here, and I think it's weakest the more coercive it becomes. You have people like Doug Wilson who want to create a Christian state. I think it's a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength. If you want America to become less Christian, the fastest way to do it is by putting a gun to people's heads.
yes, but if you passed a Christian amendment, which was what happened in American Samoa, I don't know if you're aware of that, but now there seems to be problems about wanting to make other religions illegal, and
Mm.
I, I think they only passed it because that there were some immigrant Muslim immigrant workers that they were a bit concerned about,
Yeah.
and now I think they're thinking of banning Islam in American Samoa.
Well, it's
But
it's. What do you think? Let me ask you this: what do you think? What does it tell you that American Muslims who enter into American politics that the that or well, I guess they're not. It depends on who they are, but say Mandani, right? That and then we've. I don't think the guy who just won, Dr. Saeed, who won in Michigan.
hmm
I don't. Is he Muslim as well, or is he a
yes,
Christian a Middle Eastern
he's
guy?
Abdul El Zayed. Um, but
But what do you
I think the
think of the
problem.
fact that Muslims who are participating in American democracy are amongst the most liberal or slash progressive. They they're
Yes,
they're
they have to
they're
be in order
playing
to
on the
get
far
accepted.
left. They're not playing on the far right. What do you think of that?
Well, Mamdani, he did go out of his way to be, kind to LGBT and transgender people. So, and I think Michael Jones called him a Jew, a liberal Jew disguised as a Muslim, and we know he came from a very wealthy family, and he's a good-looking chap and quite charming, and there will be these um, cultural Muslims. And you also have this problem in England too, because you might have a few successful Muslim families. They have enough to send their daughter or son to a private school, and then they get chosen to be the token Muslim. But then the real Muslims who take their religion seriously will know they'll be betrayed by these um, upstart types, I suppose.
Well, just looking here at his bio just real quickly is um his full name is I can't pronounce his full name. It's his middle name is Muhammad. So Muhammad, it's Abdul Rahman. Yeah, I guess
hmm
it's Abdul Rahman Muhammad Al Said
hmm
or Syed. Um, certainly, it sounds like a Muslim name.
Yeah,
Um,
but then he had to go out of his way to say things like he venerates Jews, which um,
I
might
don't
be.
I don't know if I'd use the word venerate, but respects Jews or something like that. Okay.
Yes, he actually said venerate.
The
So
word
that seems.
venerate.
Yes,
It's such an odd choice of words.
it is, isn't it? So that's been commented on. But the thing is, I mean, you have these sort of, somebody looking, whatever race they're supposed to look and represent, and actually, you know, the doing, they're just there as a front to make certain minorities feel well represented, but the policies will be the same, such as.
That's what
Uh,
I'm saying, though, is these people are choosing. I mean, they're not coming in. This is the great anxiety that nativists have about these immigrants. These immigrants are leaning into their Americanism, they're not importing their values at all. They're embodying American values to the extreme.
Yes, it's the American values that the nativists don't like, though, which is Zionism.
Well, Zionism. Okay, what do we mean by Zionism? I
Well,
mean, is it
well
support? Is support for Israel blanket? Just any support whatsoever for Israel? Is that considered Zionistic?
I suppose so. I mean, from what I can gather, it's why are we paying for this? Why are we paying for this? kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you talk about the petrodollar and Israel being the unsinkable aircraft carrier of America, they don't quite get it. I suppose they would rather not participate at all.
Okay, just a quick update. According to Google, no, Dr. Al Said did not say that he venerates Jews. Following his win in Michigan, he said something like, "My commitment to your safety, my commitment to Jewish safety is the same commitment that I have to the safety of my own daughters." Seems very reasonable. But as for Israel, I mean, it's like, yes, I mean, it's like, it's like we've lost any ability to manage nuance. Um, I mean, that's when I hear the phrase "from the border to the sea." Well, that sounds rather exterminationistic, right? That sounds like what we're going to do is just wipe out the Jewish people in Israel and replace, just we're going to dominate the land. It's very that's that's very extreme. I'm so I won't cooperate with that. I'll oppose that. On the other
Yes,
hand, I have real serious problems with the way Israel has conducted its war against the Palestinians in Gaza, and I think
mm-hmm.
it's been grotesque and irresponsible, and there are real crimes having been committed, and certain individuals should be held to account. Does that make me anti-Semitic? See, some people will say one side makes me a Zionist, the other side makes me a anti-Semite. I occupy a different a middle position that says no, I'm not going to let you exterminate the Jews in the region, and no, I'm not going to let you exterminate the Palestinians either. For whichever side I'm talking to.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Zionism, and what is whatever the opposite of that is?
Well, if you look up Wikipedia, you'll see a long list of different kinds of Zionism. But maybe the quickest way to understand it, in my view, is to think of Israel as an American colony and a way of projecting power in the Middle East to keep an eye on the Arabs and the oil.
Well, it wasn't. It certainly didn't. Its history of it didn't start out that way. In fact, the United States wasn't an enthusiastic ally of Israel under Truman and Eisenhower. I mean, it was, in fact, Eisenhower, the whole what's the canal? Foggy today. The
The Panama Canal, the
No,
Suez
no,
Canal.
Suez Canal, the Suez controversy. Israel, France, and Britain were going to seize the canal from Egypt, and they started a war that Eisenhower refused to support. So I mean, as late as Eisenhower, we weren't an enthusiastic anything goes with Israel. I don't think the United States saw Israel as a foothold in the Middle East. It seems to have become that. I don't think it started out that way.
Mm.
And now we got to wonder, well, is the tail wagging the dog at this point? When you see how um, Netanyahu has played Trump like a fiddle, and we've severely depleted our stockpiles of smart munitions in this ludicrous war against Iran, that we had, and we're now negotiating for a much worse deal than we had under the Obama administration. And Israel is by no means safer as a result. But but it seemed like this. I tend to see Netanyahu as just, I have no respect for the man. Put it that way. But I have no respect for my president either. So
Yes, I get the impression that they're there to give the impression that they are an independent country, but of course, I don't think they can do any of the things that they do, um, if it if if Israel didn't already have the unwavering support of America. Um, and Iran has said that it sees Israel as a proxy of America.
well, but is Iran has the regime that see their hands aren't clean in any of this by a long shot. I mean, they've they've armed, they've played a key role in arming Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen,
Hmm.
and they've played a role in they've been behind a lot of terrorism over the years. Um, they've perpetuated these proxy wars that were relatively small in scale, but were a nuisance to Israel, to say the least. And then, of course, October 7th was no small thing, and Iran had a hand in it, making it possible. And I don't know how
Mm.
you justify that under any circumstances.
I've heard some Jews talk about October 7 as that's our 9/11,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that suggests that they thought it was in some way, um,
A license to do anything.
to give them the excuse to, you know, yes. And we don't know. I mean, perhaps Israel is a kind of weapons testing ground. And you can imagine all the arms manufacturers saying, tested in Israel on real people.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people. There are some people, maybe not a lot of people. There's certain people making a lot of money off of these ventures.
Hmm.
Every time the oil markets fluctuate, somebody on the inside is making money. They have enough time and information to prepare a hedge or
Yes.
something. They can make a lot of money on an up and down market that's highly volatile. Um, but I'm not so cynical as to think that people are just saying, well, we're just going to create violence to test out these. One thing, I mean, if anything, the Iran war has proven out to be what a paper tiger the American multi-trillion-dollar military has turned out to be. Um, the the military that just flattened Saddam Hussein really twice um, has proven that it's really it while it can do a lot of damage. It can kill. It can be very precise in how it kills. It ultimately can't um, take control of a simple um, passageway for commerce. Can't control the Strait of Hormuz. It can't defend shipping. Um, it can't control. It can't protect the free flow of oil out of the Middle East, and
Well, there
therefore
is
can't provide energy to its our eastern allies in East Asia. Go ahead.
there is this theory that all this is to do with um, squeezing China and choking off its supply of energy. And there is a deadline, which is 2030, because apparently the experts think by 2030, if nothing bad happens to China, um, it will surpass America with its population and enterprise, and that mustn't be allowed to happen. And therefore, um, attacking Russia is indirectly a way of attacking China, because they're both allies, and you know, um, and to do with energy supplies. And
Well, I don't. Russia, see that Russia created its own problems. I mean, there's no question that. I mean, it. No one could have predicted. No one did predict that Ukraine would resist as effectively as it has, even with Western help. Um, and it looks like Ukraine can sustain this war longer than the Russians can at this point.
well,
The
yes,
only
because
thing,
of the
go ahead.
most of the Ukrainian women have left the country, and um, it seems strange to me that men would want to fight wars when the women have gone, because there's nobody there to protect, really.
I don't know if I don't think the number is quite. No, there are a lot of there are a lot of refugees. I don't know if it's a majority of Ukrainian women, but it's the war is continuing and the Russians are losing. In the same way, the war is continuing against Iran. It's not as long of a war, but the war is continuing in Iran and America is losing. There's no, I mean, America is flat out losing this war for no good reason other than the fact that our military is too expensive and doesn't know how to cope with um, cheap munitions. That we just don't know how to cope with the new style of warfare,
Mm.
which the geniuses in the Pentagon should have been watching what was happening in Ukraine and said that could be us. Unlike anywhere else, we have this navy. The Chinese have the ability to build a big navy. They can outbuild us now. They can do what we did to. They can now do what we did in World War II and basically manufacture huge volumes of ships and tanks and anything you want. It's not clear they quite know what to do with them, but do they even need to at this point? I mean,
Mm.
it's like they they can build 10 ships to R1 right now, and but it looks to me like it doesn't really matter until we figure out how to cheaply defend ourselves against drones that can be made in underground bunkers or in garages or who knows where they're making all this stuff. And I, all this points to me is that we don't need a fourth order. We need to restore faith and um, restore life to the liberal order. Long-term stability of the world really depends on the liberal order finding a new footing in the world that can make it defensible and something people can support.
Yes, I suppose that the problem with liberalism is it's increasingly people have been um, have felt let down by the liberal order, and
Mm.
it has no codified principles, and its terms seem to be shifting more towards sexual liberation than freedom of expression, it seems.
Well, there's definitely a lot of faith has been lost. You know, people are cynical. People are also small and petty. I mean, it's
Hmm.
like how many of the grievances are just petty? There's also grievances that are reasonable in terms of corruption. Um, trillionaires who can get away without paying taxes, even while a regular working person may see a third or half of their income go disappear in taxes to the government. So it's um, we have this. tiny elite who control vast sums, and the crumbs are left to the rest of the people to squabble over, and that does fuel resentment and cynicism.
Yeah, so
So
when we think of how the French, after the American Revolution, resented having to pay for it, and took the matter into their own hands against their king. Um, so that could be a problem, because I think once you no longer trust your government, then how can it tell you anything? Because people will just do the opposite, or cook up some conspiracy theory if their government, tells them to do this, and they'll think, we'll do the opposite because we know you don't mean well for us, and we don't trust you, and this will make things
sure.
quite
No, what
difficult.
do people? People lose faith, but that's you know I don't know. You can. The alternative, though, is what? You know, are you really think you're going to be better off in a techno feudal state? You know, where you, instead of a um, warlord as your, you know, you're going to have to. It'll be a corporation or a tech guru or something is going to
Well,
be
there've been so
your
many dystopian movies. I was thinking of RoboCop and Mad Max, and you
right.
know,
Yeah.
uh,
I don't know. I think everything points to me as to doubling down on on the liberalism. And yeah, I mean, there are if there are excesses, then we'll deal with the excesses. But are the excesses of liberalism all that bad? I mean, it's not the you know. I guarantee you, if you made it more economically feasible for uh, women to have children, um, it would you're going to have more children. I mean,
well, yes. So
after
you have to support marriage, and then you have to not be paying maternity pay, and you have to be, well, paying men more, or married fathers more, to make them more attractive as marriage prospects, and all these
well, or
economic.
just make it. In this case, it doesn't really matter how much you make. So one of the problems is that we boosted during the Biden administration during COVID. Um, and here in California, certainly we increased pay for everybody. People made more money. They were just given money. They were the phrase that the Fed used, um, shoveling money out of helicopters, type of thing.
Hmm.
Um, all that did was disrupt market. I mean, the markets were already disrupted because of COVID, but then because it resulted in supply shocks. But the extra liquidity in combination with the supply shocks resulted in a great deal of inflation and shortages.
Hmm.
Um, so we ended up going from paying $3 a dozen for eggs to paying $10 a dozen for eggs, just as one example. Um, and so you you can't increasing pay alone accomplishes very little because inflation will simply eat up the increases in pay. You have to you have to push. You can't just push on the demand end, but you have to also push on the supply. You have to provide more supply to match demand. So it's like you say we provide housing allowances to help families own homes. But if there isn't an increase in the supply of homes, those allowances will just become very quickly worthless because they can only they'll where the allowance may say you create an allowance that will allow you to put a 10% down payment on the average house. But if you don't increase supply to be prepared for the demand, that allowance will shrink very quickly and only be worth 1% of the value of the house, because demand will just simply spike, create inflation. So
Mm-hmm.
it, it seems like it's not just a make men important again. It's it seems like we have to, in a very liberal way, um, enable people to. One of the strengths of liberalism is the freedom that people have to make their way in the world and to find what works best for them. So just engineering a solution that says, well, we're going to put our thumb on the scale for um, nuclear families in the traditional
Mm-hmm.
1950s sense of the term. I don't, I, I don't think that will work if it's not organic to the culture. What do we really, when we say we want nuclear families, what we're really saying is we want a certain kind of stability that
Mm-hmm.
that allows for the safe, reliable rearing of children
Mm-hmm.
who grow up to be good citizens who contribute to the society and the economy in the long term, and so in a way that's sustainable. Can you make that happen from the outside in, or do you trust people to know what they need, know what they want, and simply get out of their way to allow them to realize? And you got to remove obstacles. I mean, part of the problem in the American past has been monopolists. Monopolists have come and gone many times in the United States, and sometimes the monopolists need their wings clipped so that freedom can, so that the economy can shift and evolve too, and people can be free. Um, and we made we, I think it's very possible that we need to make it. There are a lot of powers at work that make people not want to have kids, and it's not just um, government policy. But at this point, thank you for letting me play at responding to Claire Caw with facts and logic.
Well,
It's
well, well,
late where you
thank you.
are.
Yes, yes, and I just wanted to acknowledge the very interesting comments by Tony Tiger Great, and um, uh, who is very well informed about um, lots of things, historical and economic and anthropological, it seems. And
Well, he has a view. I
yes,
don't know. I mean, like, okay, Russia will eventually retake Constantinople to secure maritime access. I don't think if Russia can't win a war against Ukraine, it certainly cannot win a war against Turkey. Turkey
well, there is a
Turkey is a
suspicion.
much, much, much more formidable foe than Ukraine, and it is an essential member of NATO.
Mhm.
So I think that is a guaranteed no go.
Well, I must send you the link to this YouTube channel called The Duran. I don't know if you heard of them, and I think their geopolitical commentary should be of interest to you. I'll send you the link by email. They're quite accessible,
Okay.
and
The Tony says they could destroy Ukraine in a day, but they are playing long ball, Mark. Um,
probably to exhaust the Europeans and cause economic collapse, and and then they'll sing a different tune, perhaps. Who knows?
well, the Ukraine war has strengthened the European identity um, as in opposition. Um, since the war, NATO has added Sweden and Finland to the NATO alliance. Poland is turning out to be very formidable as well. I think any attempt for Russia to expand the war, it, it, yes, in theory, Russia has plenty of functional nuclear weapons. We don't know how many at this point, since these things do need to be maintained. And their ability to maintain them is arguably not what it was. So they yes, they could, in a kind of act of suicidal terrorism, nuke Ukraine, only to get much worse
They'll probably
from the
nuke
West.
Britain just to show the, the Europeans what's what.
It's very possible the British have. I mean, the British nuclear. We really don't know how sound the Russian nuclear arsenal is at this point. And see, the war with Ukraine was expected to last like 2 weeks. The fact that the Ukrainians have kept it going for years at this point, and they've managed not only to they've isolated Crimea, they're they've they've made they've made killing Russians on scale easy. It's they've lowered the cost of killing the Ukrainians. This is a really something I saw that was really interesting. Was an article, and I'd have, you can Google it. I'm sure it's not too hard to find. But the economics of killing in war has collapsed because of drone warfare. It used to be very, very expensive when you thought about how much it cost to kill an enemy combatant, say in World War I or World War II, because it's not just the cost of the bullet or the cost of the artillery shell, but there's the ship, there's all the logistics behind it and the
Mm-hmm.
delivery of it, and the bullets that miss versus the ones that hit, right? So it was actually very expensive to kill somebody in World War I and World War II, and it has been very expensive to kill people historically. But because the precision and the inexpense of the Ukrainians drone warfare program, they've collapsed that cost into something like a few $100s, where it used to be many thousands,
Mm-hmm.
and per kill. And it's fascinating, the idea that, the Russians, on the other hand, have not managed to do that, and the United States are, it's again the expense. Um, the economics of violence just are not in the Russians' favor. That's what I would say to all that. And it's just completely. I mean, the idea that Russia is going. I'm telling you guys, Turkey is a beast. And it is a regional. It's a regional major power, if not superpower, in the Eastern Europe, Mediterranean,
Yes, I think it
and
has the
in.
largest NATO army of all.
Mhm.
I think I seem to remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah, it is, and
Mm.
it's, you know yeah, sure. The thing is history's so funny, is historical images. I think people's memory of Turkey is from World War I and from movies like uh, Lawrence of Arabia or something, where the Ottoman Turks were grossly incompetent and out of date, and a kind of backward, failing sort of society. The Turkeys come out of all of that, and they're they're the future of the Middle East, frankly. They are more the future than Israel or Saudi Arabia or Iran. They're a well-educated population. It's economically dynamic. They don't have our problems with that the Western Europeans have with regard to demographics. They aren't aging into oblivion. Um, they're a force. And the Poles, the people think of the Poles. The Polish performance during World War II was, of course, they were overwhelmed by the Wehrmacht, but that's not the Poland of the day, folks. The Poland of the day is more like the Germany of yesteryear. It is a force to be reckoned with, and they will not capitulate to the Russians. So I think Putin's in a pickle. Now he's got one strong ally, and that's China. And China is enjoying watching America spend itself now in two wars. And because we got a president with his head where it shouldn't be.
Well, I hope US citizens will in future be more consulted about US foreign policy because it does affect them ultimately
Who?
in the amount of taxes they pay, whether personally or through their children or grandchildren. And well, obviously that there are consequences
Yeah.
too when empires fail.
Yeah. Well, and then if it's we'll see. I mean, it's America. America has risen to such heights. It takes a long time to fall when you're as it did. The Roman Empire did not fall in a decade. It took
No,
centuries. So it and the story of its fall is interesting in itself. So nothing's over till it's over. Um,
true.
but we and I wouldn't count the UK. The UK is currently kind of a economic basket case, but
It is. It is.
it's kind of a basket case like America. It's kind of a basket case of its own making. It America is actually much better resource than the UK, being an island. But the United States has a lot of resources. It is still well positioned. If we unlike one thing that uh, Stephen Kotkin pointed out in a fairly recent interview. He's the historian. He's a Russian historian of Russia and Stalin, who's based out of Stanford. He's pointed out that you know Xi Jinping was went to a major figure, a major statesman in East Asia, I think in Singapore, I can't remember his name, and was pointing out that how well positioned China is for the future, and that he had China is going to win the global competition because it has 1.5 billion people to draw from. And
Hmm.
he was bragging about that, and maybe was it Joe and Lai? I don't remember. Was that doesn't sound
Lee
right?
Hsien Loong, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe.
Anyways, this statesman turned to him and said, "No, you don't understand. America doesn't have 1.5 billion people to draw from. It has 8 billion people to draw from.
Hmm.
Well, that is to say, because everyone wants to live here. All America has to do is be nice to the people who want to come here, and we have our pick of the world. If we don't,
Yes.
again, if we leaned more into our liberal values and our tradition, we can outcompete everyone because we are the place where everyone wants to be. And we seem to have squandered that, and that's probably no longer the case right at this minute, but yet it's still more often than not people want to live here a lot of people want to come to America even if they can't. A lot of people are fighting to stay in America even as they are being driven out. So um, our our long-term position is probably not as threatened as it looks like in the short term.
Hmm. Um, Lawrence Wong is the Prime Minister of Singapore, if that was who you were thinking of. But
Maybe I will, if I can find a clip. It was a really good discussion on. I can actually share the discussion, and maybe if anybody wants to.
oh yes, that would be interesting.
Um, Stephen Kotkin is kind of he's currently my favorite historian and analyst. What's it called? Oh, five more questions. Yeah, here we go. Five more questions. It was 2 months ago. Unfortunately, I can't play it here because I will be, they'll copyright strike me, or will not strike
Hmm.
me, but give me a warning. But anyway, this is, um, I put it in the private chat and you can
Oh, thank you.
copy it
I'll
that
have
way.
a look.
Just, and this, just so anybody wants to know, I can show the screen, share screen. It's five more questions with Stephen Kotkin. Can America still lead the world? And in case you want to know who Stephen Kotkin looks like, that's Stephen Kotkin. Highly recommend.
I'm afraid I can't hear you. So
Oh,
I think I better go. My phone's heating up.
oh, okay.
Um,
Bye, Claire.
but thank you,
Okay,
Mark.
bye.
Thank you.
All right. That's it, folks. It was, check it out. Highly recommend it. Very cool. I don't know if I could play any of it or not, but it's a really good discussion. Um, this went a lot longer than I expected, but oh well. It's Sunday. See you later.